Bonsoir and good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Spencer-Ross, President of Heritage Ottawa and Chair of our Lecture Series Committee. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to Heritage Week, which Heritage Ottawa celebrates with its annual Phillips Memorial Lecture. Our guest speaker, Heather MacArthur, will talk about the work currently underway at the West Memorial Building. Leslie Maitland, former president of Heritage Ottawa, a member of our Lecture Series Committee and published author, will come on after the presentation to moderate questions and then to close our event. Our lecture series is made possible through the generosity of our sponsor, Andrix Holding Inc. and Sandy Smallwood. Andrix has been a faithful sponsor of these lectures, as well as of our walks and some publications. We're also grateful for an operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the province of Ontario. As we mark Heritage Week, we are asking you to consider supporting Heritage Ottawa by becoming a member, renewing your membership, or making a donation. Your contributions go a long way towards strengthening our credibility and adding legitimacy to our voice as we respond to issues such as Ontario's Bill 23, More Homes Built Faster. If you are already a member or have made a donation, we extend our heartfelt thanks. I earlier referred to this evening's event as the Phillips Memorial Lecture. This annual event was inaugurated in 2006 and is dedicated to the founders, more than 50 years ago, of the organization that became Heritage Ottawa. Indeed, it can be said without exaggeration that Bob and Marianne Phillips, whose photos you see on the screen, were the founders of built heritage consciousness and advocacy in Ottawa. In 1967, during Canada's centenary, the Phillips created an advocacy group called Capital for Canadians. Its Heritage Committee was the beginning of Heritage Ottawa, which was incorporated in 1974, and Bob Phillips was its first president. In the 1960s and 70s, with these organizations and a tremendous personal commitment, Bob and Marianne undertook information campaigns and public activism to save key historic buildings and structures in Ottawa that were under threat. Structures as diverse as the Billings House, Pretoria Bridge, and Union Station. There's a notable link between Bob and Marianne's activism and vision and the subject of tonight's lecture, the West Memorial Building. For those of us in Ottawa, and for many across this country, Wellington is an iconic street that is bounded on either side by buildings whose functions reflect our freedom and democracy. It has been very much in the news for a year now, with current discussions focusing on how the street should function now and into the future. If the West Memorial Building marks the western gateway to Wellington, then the eastern gateway is the east block of the Parliament buildings. The East Block of Parliament is an outstanding example of the high Victorian Gothic revival style. But in March 1964, plans were afoot to renovate it or demolish it in favor of a modern replacement. Then the campaigning began to save the building. Demolition was successfully averted. Central among the voices for restoration rather than replacement was Bob Phillips, whom we honor today. In 1967, Bob Phillips published a comprehensive history of the building entitled The East Block of the Parliament Buildings of Canada that celebrated the building's architectural and cultural significance. If you look on the Senate of Canada website today, you'll see that Bob Phillips and his book are credited with saving the East Block. Given their vision and success with advocating for the preservation of some of Ottawa's most iconic buildings, I think Bob and Marianne would approve of our focus tonight on the other end of Wellington Street as we look at the West Memorial Building. I hope their daughters, Margaret, Jennifer, and Bridget, agree with me. And I say to them, welcome once again to the annual lecture that celebrates your parents and honors the strength of heritage consciousness in Ottawa and the National Capital Region, to which Bob and Marianne devoted so much time, energy, and effort. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Heather MacArthur. Heather is an architect and conservation specialist with a multidisciplinary background in communications, urban studies, and architecture. Through these multiple lenses, her work explores the intersection of contemporary design and development with the physical, cultural, and historic context of a site. Heather obtained her professional degree in architecture from Carleton University. She is a registered architect with the Ontario Association of Architects. Over her nearly 20 years of experience, she has participated in the delivery of a variety of public and private sector projects involving heritage planning, adaptive reuse, renovation, and conservation of both locally designated and nationally recognized historic sites. These projects typically include working in multidisciplinary team settings with conservation and materials specialists. Through this experience, she has gained a deep appreciation for the complexities of working in historic buildings and sites, and enjoys working hands-on with conservation specialists in developing design solutions. Heather has previously worked with Julian Smiths and Associates Architects, and then Watson McEwen Taramura Architects. She currently works at ERA Architects in Ottawa, where she explores the intersections of contemporary design and the heritage context, involving both small and large-scale planning and development projects. In addition to the West Memorial Building, she is also currently working on the Center Block Rehabilitation Project. Outside of work, Heather has been a long-time volunteer advocate for heritage buildings and sites. She also enjoys putting her professional experience to personal practice, working on her own construction and renovation projects. Heather, I now turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And also thank you to Heritage Ottawa for inviting me to present this year's Bob and Marianne Phillips Memorial Lecture. I'm pleased to note that some members of the Phillips family are among the attendees this evening, which is just wonderful. And I hope that you'll find this presentation and project of interest and in line with Bob and Marianne's aspirations for heritage conservation in the capital. Tonight, I am presenting an overview of the heritage conservation dimensions of the West Memorial Building Rehabilitation Project. This project is being undertaken on behalf of Public Services and Procurement Canada, PSPC, by Regenerate 344, a joint venture of Moriyama and Tashima Architects and Kasian Architecture. To that end, I would also like to thank both PSPC and R344 for their support in delivering this lecture. As Catherine noted, I work at ERA Architects in Ottawa. In our role as heritage consultants and conservation architects on the West Memorial Project, we have developed a conservation approach and prepared the design for rehabilitation of the buildings. This includes the exterior masonry, copper roofs, original steel windows, bronze doors, as well as interior marble, among other finishes, which we will see later. To that end, I will start with an overview of the background analysis and studies that were undertaken to understand the building and its setting on Wellington Street, and which have informed the conservation approach for the project. I will conclude with a brief project update illustrating how the conservation approach is being put into action in the ongoing rehabilitation work. Starting with a brief background and historical overview of the building and its context. To situate the building and site, as Catherine mentioned, the West Memorial Building is located at the west end of Wellington Street. It's part of a monumental ensemble that was originally called the Veterans Memorial Buildings. The East Memorial Building, which we see here on the left, was built first from 1950 to 1954, and the West Memorial Building, along with the Memorial Colonnade, which joins the two buildings together across Lyon Street, was completed in 1958. The buildings are also connected through underground tunnels. The design was awarded in the late 1940s to Allward and Gwynlock Architects of Toronto, who were involved in several projects for the federal government at the time, and I will touch on their experience a little bit later. Developed adjacent to the Judicial and Parliamentary Precincts along what is now Confederation Boulevard, Ottawa's ceremonial route, the ensemble, and in particular the West Memorial Building, mark a prominent gateway to Wellington Street and the Federal Core. The Parliamentary Precinct, which is located at the west end of Wellington Street, includes the area between the Canal and Kent Streets. The Judicial Precinct, the area closest to the East and West Memorial buildings, is located at the western end of Wellington Street. We also see in the image on the left the newly completed Library and Archives building, which was constructed in 1967, and the Garden of the Provinces and Territories here in the foreground to the west of the West Memorial Building. The building ensemble was conceived as part of Jacques Gréber's 1950 plan for the national capital, which put forward a very clear and ambitious vision for the downtown core and the parliamentary precinct in particular. One of Gréber's intentions was to create a monumental ensemble at the western end of Wellington Street to serve as an anchor point, which we can see here in this photograph of the model that was developed as part of that plan. His design included a symmetrical pair of buildings along Wellington Street linked by a colonnade, which would act as a screen, framing views of an art center to be located further south. The plan was not fully realized. However, the design for the memorial buildings closely followed Gréber's vision. Making way for the project required the demolition of a collection of 2- and 3-story buildings across 2 city blocks. As this 1912 fire insurance plan shows, Upper Town, as it was known at the time, was quite densely developed by the early part of the last century. Here we see that a variety of construction types existed, including wood frame and masonry structures. The area continued to fill in as these 1933 and 1944 aerial views show. And of course, the 1944 aerial view also shows the temporary buildings located north of our site and the newly completed Supreme Court building, which we can just get off in the corner. So I'd just like to share some views of streetscapes in the area as it existed prior to the redevelopment. This will just give you a sense of the scale of transformation that was undertaken when the memorial buildings were constructed. So as the fire insurance plans showed, historic uses in the area included a variety of commercial buildings, which we can see here on the left, hotels and residential uses, as well as light industry, such as beer bottling, foundries and machine shops. There were carriage shops and auto garages and showrooms. At one time, there was also a market building called the Wellington Ward Market, which was located on Lyon Street between Queen and Sparks, just south of the East Memorial Building. This market building was intended to rival the Byward Market. The wide opening at the north end of Lyon Street was an existing urban feature, as we can see in this 1876 bird's eye view of Ottawa. In this photograph, we also see an illustration of how wide that opening was. We can also see the watering trough that existed at the north end of the street. As mentioned, this opening once featured a horse watering trough and would later accommodate car parking before making way for the memorial buildings. On the right, we see the intersection of Wellington and Bay Streets. This is Wellington crossing in front of our view and Bay Street going up to the right. As we know, this would become the signature view of the West Memorial Building ensemble and the gateway to Wellington Street. So we can see quite a contrast in the scale of what existed before this complex was constructed. Here we see another 1938 view of Wellington Street looking east with St. Andrew's Church at the corner of Wellington and Kent, which we see featured here. We also note that Wellington was quite a broad avenue with fairly consistent and uniform street wall on both sides of the street. And for comparison with that previous image, I share an image of present day view, more or less taken from the same spot. Here again, we see St. Andrew's Church in the background. And finally, a few images showing the excavation and site preparation for the East Memorial Building in about 1949. Here we see Christ Church, the Anglican Church, visible in the background, which is also with us today. And finally, we have the completed complex, this image taken sometime around 1967. While the project would fulfill the Grébert plan, which we saw earlier, it also responded to expanding services offered by the federal government at the time. A growing population and a large number of returning veterans in the post-World War II era created the need for more government services and thereby more office space. As we see in this image, the temporary buildings were also still in place and fully in use. As mentioned in the introduction, originally the Department of Veterans Affairs was centered on the East Memorial Building, which we see here in the foreground. The West Memorial Building was to provide storage for the Department of Veterans Affairs and office space for the Department of Trade and Commerce, and subsequently other government bodies. I will digress for just a moment to share a personal anecdote. My father started his career in the Department of Trade and Commerce and worked in the West Memorial Building starting in about the mid-1960s. When I asked him what he recalled about working in the building, he shared a distinct memory of the office spaces being bright and airy, but also very hot in the summer, in particular on the south side of the building. This, of course, speaks to the quality and care of design, which allowed for abundant natural light to enter all spaces as a result of the light wells and the very large windows. One could say that this was a good model of design for wellness in the 1950s, despite the challenge of temperature control. After construction was completed, the area to the south developed relatively quickly, as this 1967 aerial shows. The addition of office towers and hotels with more to follow quickly sprang up. The photo at the right shows the completed Garden of the Provinces and Territories. Coming back to Grébert's plan for the national capital, as many of you know, this plan was initiated through the then Federal District Commission with a mandate to conceive of the capital as a national war memorial. Although Grébert did not envision a memorial function in and of itself, rather the colonnade was proposed as an urban and architectural gesture, he did make several provisions for commemoration of World War II in his plan. At the eastern end of the parliamentary precinct, Confederation Square had already been designed by Grébert as a dignified setting for the existing 1939 National War Memorial, to which the dates of World War II and the Korean War were added. Later, the South African War and the mission in Afghanistan would be added, as well as other commemorative devices. At the western end, the new Veterans Memorial Building ensemble would come to take on a commemorative role of its own. With Veterans Affairs identified as the main occupant of the East and West Memorial buildings, you will recall the buildings were originally identified as the Veterans Memorial buildings. It was somewhat natural that the complex should take on a commemorative role. This was principally centered on the Colonnade with its memorial inscription and its plaza, as well as the later addition of the Canadian Phalanx bas-relief sculpture, which is still located to the north of the Colonnade facing Wellington Street. In this way, the memorial buildings and Confederation Square would thus serve as commemorative nodes, bookending the parliamentary and judicial precincts and further fulfilling the role of the capital as National War Memorial. So I'll just say a few words about the architects, Alward and Gwynlock. Established in 1935, the Toronto-based partnership of Hugh Lachlan Alward and G. Roper Gwynlock had focused its pre-war practice on residential work, for which they won several awards. In the post-war period, Alward and Gwynlock shifted to civic and institutional buildings. At the time of the East and West Memorial Building project, when it was awarded, Alward and Gwynlock were working on another project for the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto. Completed in 1948, it was Canada's largest facility for veterans healthcare. As you can see, it shares a similar classical modern idiom to the East and West Memorial Building design. Of note is the firm's versatility, as these images illustrate. They worked in both traditional forms and a more modern language. The Mechanical Engineering Building at the University of Toronto is an example of this, as we see on the left, as well as the later Hockey Hall of Fame and the now Booth Street complex, built a decade after the memorial buildings. While the Booth Street complex takes on a more modern expression in its planar massing and strip windows, it nonetheless uses a similar approach to interlocking geometrical forms which we see at the East and West Memorial buildings. The Memorial Building Ensemble has been suggested as a high point in Alward and Gwynlock's work. So moving now to the original design of the buildings and its heritage character. Although much of Grébel's plan was unrealized, the vision for the western end of Wellington Street to serve as a gateway to the Judicial and Parliamentary Precincts was fully realized, with the West Memorial Building in particular fulfilling the role of a monumental endpoint. Grébel had clear intentions for how to articulate this western extremity, as we can see in this street section at the top of the slide. Part of which was to complete the town side of Wellington Street as a homogeneous and disciplined counterpart from the more picturesque pavilions, which we know exist on the north side of the street. This architectural discipline therefore called for an alignment of classically inspired building of uniform height and setback along Wellington. The western end of Wellington would therefore be anchored by a monumental pair of buildings, which would act as a gateway with formal facades on both Wellington and Bay Streets, which we see here, this being Wellington, this is Bay, this is Lion. And which would dialogue with the green space that we know would come later, the Garden of the Provinces and Territories. Its integration with the nearby parliamentary precinct and with the street wall on the south side of Wellington was also achieved through the use of sloped and batten coffer roofs, which acknowledged its federal context. The gateway function and monumentality are also expressed through the use of the classical moderne style. Elements of this style employed at the memorial buildings include a three-part composition of base, shaft, and capital, which are further emphasized by the stepped volume composition, which is highlighted here in blue, stepping back as the building goes up. This simultaneously refers back to the classical tradition, while integrating modern characteristics such as the interlocking geometrical forms, the restrained ornament such as flattened details and shallow piers, as well as the use of steel windows. While the Grébel plan did dictate much of the design, some other notable principles and intentions underpinning the design are also worth noting. So we see here the careful composition of the building facade, which served to connect the building to its context on all four sides, including providing multiple entrance points to the building. The incorporation of Beaux-Arts influences, seen mostly here in the composition and symmetry of the ensemble, but also the composition of the elevations, provided rhythm and proportion that reflect the interior layout of the design. And again, here seeing the Sparks and Bay Street elevations. Restraint of the classical moderne style also carries to a very controlled and balanced treatment of the landscape, in particular where the building meets the public realm. This approach gives a sense of grounding and permanence. The design strategies include long window wells along the south, east, and north elevations. These are defined by granite-capped walls and contribute to further emphasizing the stepped massing while also highlighting the building entrances. At the entrances on Wellington Street, we see the use of massive granite steps and sidewalls, which again anchor the vertical volumes, especially at the Northeast Tower, which we see here on the left. The overlapping granite terraces along Lyon and Wellington Street further anchor the base of the building, which we can see here, the step planters here, and then where it returns onto Lyon Street, it delimits the commemorative plaza. In contrast, on Wellington, we see soft landscaping between the entrances, which acts as a counterpoint to the hard surfaces and stair projections at those building entrances. On the building interior, the entrance lobbies have the highest level of, just a sec. Sorry, I lost my spot there. Let me just jump back for a second. So on the building interior, so we're looking here at the circulation plans. There's important features of the building interior that include the circulation plan, which again reflects that Beaux-Arts planning principle, notably the figure 8 plan, which we see here, featuring double-loaded corridors throughout the building. The hierarchy of spaces is also evident in the scale and material palette of the different spaces. For example, the lobbies, which we see here in dark blue, and the principal corridors on the main floor of the building are expressed as having greater importance than, say, the office spaces, which are off of the corridors. The entrance lobbies have the highest level of finishes, establishing them as the most important of the interior public spaces. They're characterized by marble floors and full wall marble paneling, some of which is book matched. They also feature plaster cornices and ceilings, painted metal elevator doors. And here we see the northeast lobby, which is the primary building entrance with its material palette. The typical lobby material palette sets the stage for the character of other spaces in the building. The primary circulation, which we see at left here on the main floor of the building, has a similar material palette and expression as the lobbies on the first floor, whereas the secondary circulation, which I haven't shown, is more simplified with plaster walls and simple linoleum floors. The fifth floor ministers' suites, which we see here at the bottom, are substitute the marble paneling of the public spaces with wood paneling, which speaks to the more private function of these spaces. Although the different areas have different material palettes, there is an overall consistency in how the floors, walls, and ceilings are articulated and treated. For example, the baseboards are consistently of a contrasting material throughout the building, and the walls are often a series of horizontally stacked elements. The treatment of doors and frames is similar in all areas of the building. Other characteristic features included an innovative strategy of flexible office space planning with movable wall partitions. And as mentioned earlier, the building arrangement around a pair of light wells came from a desire for wellness and affording office spaces with ample natural light and fresh air. Given this important history and context and the unique design of the building ensemble, the East and West Memorial buildings were designated a classified federal heritage building in 1992. The designation recognizes the building's strong contribution to the character of Wellington and Sparks Streets, notably their prominent position at the western gateway to the Judicial and Parliamentary Precincts. The Colonnade over Lyon Street, which creates a prominent landmark as one travels along Wellington and along Lyon, and which embodies the commemorative intention of the design. And finally, the designation recognizes the monumental permanence, which speaks to the memorial function. The copper roofs also contributing to their association with the federal government and its grouping of buildings in the precincts. So fast forward and switching gears, The East Memorial Building was renovated for the Department of Justice in the 1980s. Meanwhile, various uses were contemplated for the West Memorial Building. In 1998, the government agreed to a renovation to accommodate the National Archives. However, despite a number of approvals, these plans were never realized. The last occupants moved out of the building in 2008, and the building has sat vacant ever since. Coming to the present day, the West Memorial Building Rehabilitation Project has a mandate to rehabilitate and modernize all base building services and the building structure, including a full seismic upgrade as a key requirement of the structural design. The project also calls for ambitious energy targets, which require the building envelope to be substantially upgraded. In the short term, the interior is being fit up as swing space to temporarily accommodate the functions currently carried out at the Supreme Court of Canada building, which will allow for that building to be rehabilitated. In the long term, the West Memorial Building will accommodate a general office function. So I will now describe our approach to the rehabilitation, which is guided by a heritage conservation framework developed for this project. The framework is grounded in the values-based process and principles of the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, which a document many of you will be familiar with. That document defines tools and processes intended to guide and ensure the conservation of heritage value and character as set out in the heritage designation, which I mentioned earlier. The standards and guidelines advocate a process of understanding, planning, and intervening or implementation, which I will run through now as it was applied to the West Memorial Project. I should also note that considerable work was undertaken by PSPC prior to the commencement of this project, including development of conservation recommendations and conservation guidelines for the building. This earlier work served as an excellent starting point, which we were able to build on and apply to the specific requirements of this rehabilitation project. For example, we see here on the right a heritage significant zoning diagram, which was implemented as part of those earlier projects, which helped us to understand the areas of high, medium, and low heritage value in the building. So in terms of the understanding phase, much of that I went through earlier in terms of understanding the history and development of the building. And this is how we started the project with heritage background analysis and research phase. So this allowed us to identify and develop a deeper understanding of the design, the original design intent, the heritage values and characteristics associated with the building and site. This served as the basis for defining the conservation approach and the conservation goals for the project, and continues to guide decision-making in the current implementation phase. At the same time, a program of condition assessments, investigations, and testing was initiated. This allowed us to understand the current condition of the heritage materials and their assemblies, including, as I mentioned earlier, the masonry, marble, bronze doors, steel windows, among other elements. In some cases, mock-ups and testing were required to better understand how some elements were constructed or assembled, or how they would respond to conservation treatments. These mock-ups and investigations allowed us to develop both a protection strategy for the heritage elements during construction, as well as repair and rehabilitation approach for each material type. One example is the attachment of the marble wall panels, which could only be fully understood by testing their removal and reinstatement. Similarly, a mock-up was undertaken to understand, involving the complete disassembly of an original window into its component parts to understand how it was constructed and assembled. This would allow us to develop the rehabilitation approach for the windows. Elsewhere, using a heritage asset inventory developed during the preparatory work, we implemented a system for cataloging and tracking all heritage elements during the design and construction phase. As items are removed, they're tagged and cataloged, and their conservation treatment is identified. At the same time, protection was installed for the heritage fabric remaining in the building when the window openings were protected, and a system was developed for monitoring the in situ heritage fabric during construction, namely vibration monitoring. As you can imagine, demolition and removals activities can cause a lot of vibration and movement in the building, which could affect the attachment of heritage fabric, notably the marble wall panels. In actual time, the vibration monitors would indicate when movement is detected, and when thresholds were exceeded, we'd work with the contractor to review their tool selection or methodologies in these highly sensitive areas. Combined, these studies, background research, and investigations have helped us to understand the original design intent for the building and site, including how these have been maintained and in some cases evolved over time. With this information and understanding in hand, the team could get to work developing the conservation goals and strategies that would guide the design of interventions needed to meet the requirements of the new program. So I'll quickly run through the conservation goals for the project. A key objective was to address the requirements of the new program, both the interim use and long-term use, in a manner that would conserve the heritage value and character of the building and its site. A principal challenge, of course, is fitting a very specific interim program, including courtroom functions, into a building that has very strong and defined formal characteristics, as we've seen previously. To facilitate this, we developed a set of conservation goals and strategies to help guide our work at every scale. The overall overarching conservation goal is to meet the functional and technical requirements for both, as I mentioned, the both interim and long-term programs, while reinforcing the building's Beaux-Arts space planning and classical modern qualities. This goal takes into consideration the requirements for the flexibility of use while providing base building upgrades in a manner that would minimize impact on heritage character. In terms of the contemporary layer, this would require working within available floor space, and you may have guessed by now, using the light wells as an opportunity for expansion. Any external additions would need to be minimal and subordinate to the building and setting. Starting at the macro scale, looking at the building in relation to its site, the aim was to maintain and reinforce the formal quality and symmetry of the East and West Memorial buildings linked by the Memorial Colonnade and its central plaza. The formal Beaux-Arts composition should continue to be read as a balanced and unified complex. This would also include maintaining the provenance of the building's relationship along Wellington Street and enhancing its role as the western gateway to the federal core. In terms of the building exterior, the goal is twofold. On the one hand, the aim is to maintain the characteristic massing of the building by locating any required additions where they would have least impact on the site and the external composition of the facades. On the other hand, the goal aims at maintaining the appearance of the building envelope by accommodating base building upgrades on the interior of the building. In this way, the original steel windows and the exterior stone facade and copper roof would be maintained. With regards to the interior, the goal and supporting strategies were threefold. On the one hand, the goal is to maintain the original approach to spatial organization and hierarchy, which I highlighted earlier. That is, maintaining the configuration of the corridors, notably that Figure 8 plan, and preserving the relative prominence of primary areas such as the marble-clad entrance lobbies. We also aim to minimize impacts to areas of high heritage value by concentrating modifications in lower heritage value or to non-character defining elements. The goal, of course, is to promote use in areas of high heritage value by maintaining their original purpose, such as maintaining an entrance lobby as an entrance lobby. And finally, to guide the design of the contemporary layer, the aim is to ensure that alterations or additions are conceived as part of a cohesive layer that complements the Beaux-Arts spatial planning and the classical modern aesthetic of the original design. So how does this all play out in practice? Well, I'll use the design renderings prepared by Regenerate 344, the prime architects, to describe how the conservation goals and strategies are implemented throughout the project and how the building's heritage character is being protected. while meeting contemporary requirements. So starting at the building exterior, the strategies have been informed by the goal of maintaining the monumentality of the memorial complex, in particular its relationship with Wellington Street, while enhancing its role as a gateway to the city core. As noted earlier, the tight building footprint and desire to maintain the axial symmetry of the overall complex offered little opportunity for additions outside the building footprint. As a result, the formal Beaux-Arts composition and the ensemble is protected by fitting all new functions within the existing footprint. The building's west elevation, which you don't see here, remains, and its heritage character and relationship to its environment are conserved. Strategies related to the exterior have also been informed by the desire to maintain the integrity of the building's current appearance. As I mentioned earlier, no substantial additions are required on the exterior, leaving the building's original composition unchanged. Similarly, the base building upgrades are accommodated within the building without impacting its exterior finishes and fabric. There will be some modifications, however. I'll just jump back to this one on the east elevation of the building to incorporate a new public entrance facing the central plaza. The intervention is planned to be fully reversible, with all salvage material being cataloged and stored offsite to allow for future reinstatement. As I mentioned, the east and west light wells are, of course, identified as suitable for accommodating the large courtroom and assembly hall functions. While the light wells become interior spaces, they will remain largely legible and distinct from the original floor plate of the building. So generally speaking, the required modifications have been concentrated in areas of low heritage value, and major changes are concentrated in areas also of lower impact. So this brings us to the current phase, the project implementation. I'll conclude with a few images of ongoing and current project activity, which illustrate how the building's heritage fabric and original design intent are being preserved in practice. This will hopefully give you a little glimpse of what's happening behind the scaffold and inside the building and in various workshops around the city. So starting with the interior, the project began with a demolition and abatement phase, which required removal of non-heritage building elements and abatement of designated substances, both of which were needed to prepare the building for new construction. Exposing the original structure allows for the seismic retrofit and structural reinforcing, as well as the installation of new mechanical and electrical systems. It also provides an opportunity to make the building envelope upgrades from the building interior, as I mentioned, rather than the exterior, which allows the exterior appearance, the masonry, windows, roofs to be preserved. At the same time, the heritage finishes that would remain in the building are protected during construction, namely the marble-clad walls and floors. These are to protect the elements from adjacent activities. On the exterior, we're undertaking a masonry restoration campaign, working elevation by elevation. The exterior masonry is being cleaned and repaired, and all masonry joints are being repointed. This work is undertaken, of course, after a comprehensive survey of existing conditions, which I spoke to earlier. As you can see in these images, this involves very, very detailed work and very skilled work. And so far, we think it's actually looking really quite beautiful. Also on the exterior, the window restoration scope is underway. The original steel windows and terrace doors are being preserved. This requires removal of the windows to a shop setting where the frames are completely disassembled, paint finishes are removed, and damages repaired. The original hardware is refinished, and in some cases, missing components need to be cast in new, as we see here, the handles, the original window handles and replacement handles. Finally, the windows are repainted and reassembled before being brought back to site for reinstallation in their original openings. And if you passed by the building recently, you may have noticed that the windows are now painted black instead of the red color that was on the building when the project started. As part of this scope and part of that investigation phase, we undertook a paint analysis, which determined that the original color of the windows was actually black. And so the decision was taken to revert back to that original condition. And we think the black is looking fabulous. Moving up to the roof, the overall roof assembly was original to the building and closing in on 60 years of age. And while the copper skin was actually in reasonable condition, the roof deck was deteriorated. In order to replace it, the entire roof assembly had to be removed and a new roof deck and membranes installed. And all new copper roofing is now being installed, including finials and snow guards, which we can see in these images, provided to match the original in form and in detailing. And again, just the finishing is excellent. The color is so beautiful. Of course, that shiny copper won't last, but it is really coming together very beautifully. More recently on site in the courtyards, the structure for the courtyard skylights is being installed and a new floor deck is being provided inside the light wells. This is actually a really interesting and challenging part of the project. Of course, not just the installation process itself, but from the conservation perspective, the question of how to reconcile the joint where the new fabric, the skylight, will meet and integrate with the old fabric, the limestone clad walls. We want to do this in a way that is both seamless and compatible with the original design intent and also compatible with the original materials. So this work is ongoing. We don't have any process photos to share at this time, but this is a fun and interesting part of the project. Moving to the interior and its heritage finishes, we'll start with the marble flooring and wall paneling, which are being preserved. So located, as I mentioned earlier, mostly at the main floor of the building and at all building entrances, the marble is being cleaned and repaired. Where the marble has been removed to facilitate other work, such as the structural upgrades I mentioned earlier, the marble is repaired in a shop setting and stored off-site until it can be reinstalled in the building. The in situ marble, as I showed earlier, remains behind protection, and when the project gets to that phase, the protection will be removed and that marble will actually be repaired on site. Similar work is being undertaken to other interior finishes, including the wood stair handrails, original clocks and light fixtures. And here we see brackets for the handrails and other elements that will be reinstalled in the building lobbies. The elevator cab interiors, which remain largely intact, will also be rehabilitated and adapted to meet current accessibility and other standards. The question of how to seamlessly integrate these changes and incorporate new elements such as new handrails, lighting, and control panels, again, is another interesting challenge. Decision on how to modify the original fabric to accommodate these new elements are guided by the conservation strategies and goals that I described earlier. And I'll just end the presentation on these concluding images and a parting note to say that it has been very exciting and rewarding to work on the project and to see the gradual unveiling of the building as each segment of scaffold comes down. And also just a note of recognition, which I alluded to earlier, of all the very highly skilled tradespeople and conservators that we're so fortunate to work with on this project. You know, as consultants, we design the conservation approach and we, design the interventions on paper, but really the success comes at the end when the project is actually implemented. And I think I hope you share my enthusiasm that the building is looking beautiful. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you for your time and your interest. And I think Leslie is going to moderate the Q&A session. I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
Hello, all. Oh, that was just breathtaking. That was so exciting, Heather. You just spoke to so many things that matters so much to Ottawa, matters so much to the national capital, and frankly, speaks in a very personal term to me. And on commence les questions et les commentaires. Je vous prie de poser vos questions et vos commentaires dans la langue officielle de votre choix. And while you're busily typing away, this is my opportunity to get in first with my questions. So I did a fair amount of study on early public building design in the early 20th century, where wellness was a factor in the design of public buildings. You got to open a window. Whoa. And you got to have direct sunlight. Whoa. And cleanable surfaces. So when you talk about marble, it's not just there because it's pretty, it's there because it can be cleaned. So wellness was a central feature in these buildings, which resonates with veterans. Florence Nightingale invented the fresh air tent, and 100 years after Crimea, we're still taking on board her lessons about fresh air. So I'm wondering, where does this fit in the heritage movement? We talk about sustainability. Is that building going to be sealed? Is it going to have HVAC air? Are you going to be able to open the windows? Tell me.
Well, that part of the design, I guess, is beyond our scope in terms of HVAC systems and whatnot. Yes, I mean, the steel windows, the original steel windows, as I mentioned, are going back on the building, and they'll essentially serve as a storm window, if you will, on the exterior. New thermal windows will be provided on the interior face, because we do have these robust requirements for sustainability upgrades for the building. So yeah. So the original windows will no longer be operational or functional from the inside of the building. They will serve more as a storm unit on the exterior.
I have to say boo-hoo. But let's move on. Could you say a little more about the impact of accessibility standards? In what way will they be different or the same?
Well, again, this isn't necessarily part of the heritage scope per se, but certainly the design is intended to accommodate, accessibility. I mean, that's why there's a new entrance being added on the east side of the building to provide a more accessible route into the building. Where these interventions are added, I mean, just coming from the conservation perspective, I mentioned that east entrance is being implemented in a way so that it can be reversible. So, if we decide to at a future date revert back to a smaller building entrance, for example, that fabric can be reinstated, the windows, the doors, etc. But always keeping, I think the intent would be to provide accessible access throughout the building, for sure.
So we have overlapping questions. We have more questions about the windows. How difficult is it to switch to double pane? I think in a way you've answered that by saying the historic windows will be on the outside and there'll be new interior panes.
Exactly.
So in effect, you've created a double pane. And that must have certain technical challenges because, of course, there'll be condensation buildup between the two panes. You can allow for that?
Yeah, I mean, those original windows are, well, they weren't very efficient, let's say, originally. So they are inherently leaky, if you will, and will allow, I mean, the intent is to allow for any condensation that does occur between the historic window and the new window. There is sufficient leakiness, if I can refer to it that way, in the original windows that condensation should get carried out. So
we have another interesting question about the skilled tradespeople, and a real shout out to the skilled tradespeople. My goodness, they were amazing. And where do you get them from? Are they here in Ottawa? Do you have to do a shout out across the country? Where do you get them?
Yeah, there's quite a few, like right here, homegrown, in the city, definitely, you know, the marble contract, the stone contractors, the masonry, the window metals conservators. Yeah, there's lots of businesses located right here. And I guess, you know, during that contracting phase, you know, we look for specific requirements and experience among those trade people to make sure that we're getting, you know, we're getting the best. So
It's almost like all of Wellington Street has created an ecoclimate of heritage conservation. This,
yeah,
people are going to be studying this for decades, if not generations, how this East Block to West Memorial Building has created this phenomenal culture of heritage conservation. It's almost like Notre Dame in Paris, that this will be the node of heritage conservation skills and expertise for decades to come.
indeed, it's a good time to be in the conservation trades in Ottawa, definitely.
So looking at your work on the West Memorial Building, in what way was it informed by the earlier work on the East Memorial Building?
Well, I mean, that project definitely, I mean, it took place, well, in the 1980s. So, you know, we're talking 30 years ago, I guess, at this more than 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, at the time, the buildings had not been designated. So they're federally recognized, that is. So you know, the approach to that project didn't necessarily need to meet those heritage requirements at the time. I mean, in terms of the, you know, the new work, I can't really speak to that. You know, that's the prime architect's design process. In terms of the conservation treatments, you know, we definitely look to how the masonry had been treated and during the 1980s work on the East Memorial Building. We definitely referred to, you know, some of the roofing design and interventions that happened there. Similar to West Memorial, you know, the original windows were retained and rehabilitated, and new thermal units were added inside the building. So yeah, there was definitely some opportunities to explore in that earlier work that could inform the later work.
We have one question asking if the convoy occupation interrupted your work at all, or just able to work around.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to, the site progress necessarily directly. I mean, certainly there were trucks parked on Wellington and there was a lot of honking. And some days might have been a bit more challenging to get into the building than others. But yeah, I mean, I can't speak to specific schedule. I don't know if it impacted that or not, but they certainly were, their presence was known and felt from the scaffold in particular.
Were there any particular heritage elements which are a real challenge for you? Oh, how do we do this? Challenge, fun, hard to do, can't crack the nut. How are those?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you know, all the materials we're working with have their challenges. You know, there's approaches we know and experiences from other buildings that we can apply to this project, but of course every building has its own specificities, you know, on yeah, I mean, I can't say there's one challenge in particular. You know, we just have to take each one of them on their own merit and particularities related to this building. You know, the marble, for example, we did that mock-up to remove the panels and see how they were attached. You know, we really had to do that work in order to understand when we reinstall the marble, you know, what's the methodology to develop for that reinstallation.
It's almost like forensics, but for buildings.
Kind of, I guess. Sure.
Yeah. So, and I have a question about the green roof. So copper roofs were actually intended to oxidize.
Sure.
So they go from that lovely, wonderful copper color of your kitchen pots to the dark green. So was this intended? Was that the plan?
You mean originally or in the current?
Well, in the current iteration, are you,
Yeah.
you're planning for them to oxidize?
Yeah, the copper's not being treated in any way. Yes, it will eventually go green. I mean, it's already quite a deep brown color, the earliest installations, and it will eventually go green.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions about the connections between the east and the west. I understand there was an underground tunnel, and also at grade level, how convenient that connection is at the pedestrian level. It's just, kind of scary if you're a pedestrian.
Yeah.
So how is all that being managed, and that also speaks to the question of public accessibility?
Sure.
Might be out of your scope, but
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the colonnade, the memorial colonnade is a separate project. I mean, it will be implemented by the time the West Memorial opens. I mean, I'm not sure I'm quite understanding the accessibility issue or question. I mean, the two buildings won't necessarily communicate through the colonnade.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, it will be repaired and rehabilitated. But yeah, at grade, I mean, there will be a plaza, redesign there.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering the question about the
Yeah,
accessibility.
I'm not sure either. Where was the marble sourced from?
Where is the marble sourced from? That's a good question. You have me stumped.
Okay, well, we'll leave that with you, and if you get the answer, we'll post it for you.
Sounds good.
Now, were you able to reuse any of the copper from the original roof?
No, I mean, when it comes off, it's very difficult to reuse it in its original configuration. So I mean,
Send
it's
it back,
obviously
melt it down.
Yeah, exactly. It's recyclable, but not reusable on the new installation.
Well, it's all of Wellington Street has been a game of musical chairs for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and it will continue to be. So the Supreme Court's going to move over there. And now we're getting questions. Oh, can we tour the Supreme Court before they shut it down for 20 years? That may be out of your scope, but maybe you know something about that, perhaps?
I don't. I'm sorry, but that sounds like a wonderful idea.
We'd all like to know. Okay,
Yeah,
so we all like to know. And I have one question about that little island with the memorial arch.
Yep.
It's so moving, but quite frankly, it's nothing more than a traffic headache. Is there some way of managing that so its commemorative value gets appreciated and somehow or other isn't such a traffic headache? It gets degraded by that. It's a disrespect. What can I say?
Yeah, it has its challenges for sure. I mean, again, that's not directly part of the West Memorial's scope at this time.
No.
But my understanding is, the plaza design, that, as you say, that island, is scheduled for a rethink for sure.
And on a final note, and a more personal note, so in what way did this project speak to you, Heather?
Well, I guess, I mean, it's kind of what Catherine said at the beginning. I find it really exciting and invigorating to work, hands-on with conservators, with the tradespeople, and like I said in my conclusion, I mean, there's one thing to be sitting in your office and, reading about conservation approaches and laying all of that out in theory, as you will, but it's when you get into the building and get to see the actual physical results, or in the workshops and see the repairs and the investigations that they have to do. And I think that's the most exciting part for me, is really putting it into practice and being able to work with all these amazing skilled people.
It always comes down to the people, doesn't it?
It sure does. Yeah. It makes all the difference. Absolutely.
Well, on that note, let me thank you so much, Heather, for such an engaging evening, for such an engaging presentation. I have to say personally, aspect of wellness in design really resonated with me.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank you. I would like to thank Bob and Mary Ann's daughters, Margaret, Jennifer, and Bridget for being present. And Heather, final note. That was just absolutely stirring. Thank you so much.